So to our expert panel, first up will be Tony Harstrup, who is Professor of International Politics in the Department of Politics at Manchester University. Her research interrogates the manifestations of power hierarchies in global politics, including how these interact with peace and stability and security in Africa, as well as feminist, post-colonial, decolonial approaches to international relations and regional governance. Next will be Dr. Volodymyr Dubovik, Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations and Director of the Center for International Studies at the Michnikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine. His research interests lie in US-Ukraine relations, foreign policy, and regional international security. Then we'll turn to Sumya Mishra, who's based at the Lao China Institute at King's College London. Previously, she's taught at the King's India Institute. Her work examines internal migration, special economic zones, and Chinese investment across India. Currently, she's a postdoctoral research associate on a project that examines the impact of China-associated special economic zones across Africa. And our discussion, Dr. Natasha Kurt is Senior Lecturer in International Peace and Security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And she's also the founder and co-convener of this working group. And her research interests lie in security of Russia and Eurasia, particularly as that pertains to Asia. Okay, so firstly then I will hand over the floor to Professor Tony Harstrup. Thanks, Tony.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me to speak about this theme. I think one of the first disclaimers I have to make is that I obviously am not speaking for the whole of the Global South. And I'm also speaking from my very specific points of expertise. Most of the work I do is quite institutional, but nevertheless, there's been some reflection, I guess, on some of these themes. I think when you look at Africa, which is my region of specialization, unsurprisingly, there are a variety of perspectives and understanding of Russia's war in Ukraine. I think at the same time, there's often a sense that there's a misunderstanding of what the motivations of those perspectives are. And often a lot of that is placed within the same, it's sort of placed it's understood through, I would say, existing lenses of how we see perhaps the United States and Russia, or the European Union, Russia, or indeed the EU and the US. And I think that one of the arguments that I would make is that this is a bit of a mistake, that there tends to be a very binary understanding, which is problematic in of itself, but I think in this particular case, it's often quite problematic. And so we had some questions around, how has Ukraine engaged the Global South since 2014, and who the important partners are. And I think all of those are really quite important. But in a sense, I think in Ukraine, I don't think really featured in the imagination of a lot of elite leadership prior to 2014 in any specific case. That doesn't mean that Ukraine did not exist, but I don't think there was any distinction between Ukraine and indeed a lot of other countries, particularly countries outside the region. In a sense, a lot of African countries experience international relations in quite a subordinated role, I would say. But at the same time, I would say in parallel to just before 2014 and post 2014, one thing that has been happening a lot in Africa is that countries, individual countries, but also regionally, have been trying to assert themselves in international relations. And there's a sense that this, the ways in which they're trying to assert themselves in international relations, which of course has a very long history, and I'm not going to recount that because I don't think we can in the time we have. there tends to be, in the conversations that are being had about Russia's war in Ukraine, and particularly perceptions of Africa's understanding of that war, that process of trying to assert themselves in international relations, which a lot of colleagues have called a process of African agency, has been discounted to a significant degree. And I think that an understanding of that could perhaps best illuminate the sort of dominant tropes and mainstream tropes about African perceptions of Russia's war in Ukraine. For example, I would say simply looking at voting at UN Security Council, or sorry, not UN Security Council, but General Assembly, I don't think it's necessarily, in this particular case, a good reflection necessarily of the nuance of perceptions of that particular conflict. That is not to say that it doesn't tell us something. I think it very much does. But what is it that it tells us? I think is something that goes beyond simply looking at the votes. So, and the reason I say this is because for a very long time, when people simply looked at the votes, and this is much more, I would say popular discourse, there tends to be, the assumption is this is a vote against Ukraine, and actually often not necessarily even a vote against Ukraine, but a vote against, yes, a vote against what is good and what is right in global politics, or a vote for Russia. And I think one would have to be blind to not note that increasingly Russia is quite prominent in the politics of a lot of African countries. I think that influence can be quite malign, actually. But I don't think that that's the reason why necessarily votes go the way they go. And I think, to my mind anyway, in the African context, there has to be more nuance around some of these conversations. I think Ukraine, of course, has been important to African countries in terms of global supply chains around food, for example. And unfortunately, until there was a sort of a push for a negotiation around this was not high on the agenda of priority of a lot of the more powerful countries. And so, in a sense, the stuff that happens at the level outside of elite politics seems to a lot of folks to be more important. Prior to 2014 and post 2014, you had a lot of African students that were training. So a lot of medical schools in Ukraine trained a lot of African students, which meant that on that level, on educational exchange level, there was a lot of contact, a lot of communication. So unsurprisingly, I would suggest that there has been a lot of empathy for the conditions of Ukraine, the incursion of Russia into Ukraine. But of course, again, if we were to listen to mainstream discourse, this is not the case. So I guess my one big theme is that first, votes in Security Council, I don't think are as simple of an indicator as a lot of the mainstream discourses about African perspective tends to be. Secondly, that we do need to look beyond elite discourses when we're sort of thinking about Africa's engagement with Ukraine, Africa's engagement with Russia, indeed, and the West. And thirdly, that we cannot look at the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, in isolation from some of the ambitions in international politics of African states. And I think for a very long time, in the same way that we sort of tend to discount the underdog in international politics more generally, this has been the case when we're having conversations about this particular war. And finally, that of course there is no one single position when we're looking at 54 African countries, that you perhaps tend to hear some countries are a bit louder than others, but even then there tends to be a lot of focus on sound bites. So just the the idea that there's a lot more nuance and binary conversations about this particular war doesn't really resonate in the African context. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Tony. Now I'd like to hand the floor to Volodymyr. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, big thanks to everyone who put together this panel. And that's an interesting panel thematically for me, because we are now paying attention related to the issues related to Global South more than we did before this war in Ukraine, for sure. But still, not too many panels that I recently, in the last almost 2 years, since the start of the big war, large-scale war that I've taken part in, that were related to this subject. So mostly different angles of that war and different aspects and different factors that we discuss. So to me, it's very interesting, since I'm trying to step into the territory which is still very much understudied in our Ukrainians' understanding of various facets and aspects, angles to look at this war, and that's the role of the Global South. So many thanks to Bisa, to Natasha, and Victoria, and everyone else who invited me to speak here today. My angle would probably be a little different. It's more like Ukrainian views of the Global South position on the Russia-Ukraine war. So that is to be expected, since I'm not an expert per se on Global South. And of course, goes without saying that the term itself is probably not great. It's not perfect. And it's often been mentioned, if only for the reason the Global South is such a huge area, such a huge space. So basically everything, do not include in the north, in the north, which is in war right now. So you have Ukraine between the West and Russia, and everything else is the Global South. So it's not okay, because of course it's a vast, diverse space. But for the time being, of course, for the lack of a better term, that would unite all those different regions in the context of this conversation, of their reaction towards the war. We can still probably use it. And I've been seeing people from the Global South actually using it as well. So I guess it's not that politically incorrect on our part then to use it if we need to. And I must say it's been understudied as a concept, definitely in Ukraine, definitely in a context of my field of international relations. People were not necessarily paying much attention to what's going on there, too far, unrelated to us, not having major role in international relations, still living pretty much since the end of Cold War, the bipolar times in Ukraine. In a dichotomy of East versus West, very horizontal axis of our understanding of international relations. If anything, which is not related to East versus West and Ukraine, between those two, then it was probably immediate South, like a Black Sea region, the wider Black Sea region, maybe Turkey, maybe Middle East, but not further down than the Middle East and Northern Africa, for instance. So for Ukraine, if you look from Ukraine, so anything else south of that, that's kind of too far, and that's what was very much understudied. And by understudied, I mean scholarly, and also in terms of professional diplomats and politicians who were paying attention, or basically not paying enough attention to this region. Why does it matter now? I think it does matter now for a number of reasons, like where Global South stands on this issue of Ukraine-Russia war. Well, first of all, it's emerging as a big event of international relations globally to some extent. And that's another debatable point. Is it a global event or not? Is it mostly a regional event after all, or does it have actually global repercussions? We often mention global repercussions when we talk about, say, the impact and the effects of the food crisis, which is generated by the war, when the Russian agricultural goods are sanctioned, and when Ukraine is blocked, for instance, by Russia, or not blocked right now, But still we struggle with getting our agricultural produce to the international market. So immediately it have global repercussions. Suddenly I read articles in New York Times about how people in Sri Lanka, for instance, are not getting enough of food. As far as Sri Lanka. Now we also have, of course, a difficult situation in the Red Sea. In Hormuz Strait and Persian Gulf. So that's another additional feature to the problems that we're facing with transportation across the globe of various types of cargo. So that matters, I think, to where Global South stands, because, well, first of all, we're trying to win the narrative war in Ukraine with our allies in the West. We're trying to, convince everyone who's still not convinced and who cares enough to have a position that it is Russian aggressive war, it's imperialist war against Ukraine, and that's how it is. So that's why it matters. And say in the United Nations, which is not necessarily very influential and effective player in the field, but still, many times when it was discussed in the last 2 years in the United Nations, Russia basically stands isolated. For most part, with very few exceptions, and that matters, to us in Ukraine, for instance. We are seeing it as a fair fight. We're seeing it for ourselves, but it's very important for us ideologically, morally, maybe to see that other people around the globe actually see it as a fair fight, and they see Ukraine as on the right side, and Russia is not. So that matters. Another thing, of course, Global South can undermine the effort on sanctioning Russia, for instance, and some of those countries are doing that. And that's another thing that you need to understand, that if you think that Russia is doing nothing wrong, or they're both guilty, say Russia and Ukraine, or something like that, or West is waging war with Ukrainian lives against Russia, or something like that, subscribe to one of those theories, then if you're in Global South, then you just basically take the moment and say, okay, maybe we can buy more oil and gas from Russia for cheaper prices, capitalize on this opportunity right now on the moment, or maybe we can just send other goods to Russia that Russia needs for its own consumption, or to be of dual use, double use, that they can use to actually make more weapons. So there is a bunch of factors why this actually matters for Ukraine primarily, and for our allies in the West, and that's why we've seen some efforts on Ukrainian part. President Zelensky actually announced a few months ago about establishment of opening of new diplomatic missions of Ukraine in Africa, for instance, which has been definitely, Ukraine has definitely been underrepresented there in a number of countries. And Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Kuleba, went to Africa, I think maybe even a couple of times in the last 2 years. Secretary of State Blinken has visited Africa, for instance, a bunch of times, and with a focus primarily, by the way, on not just on US-Africa relations, but also on where Africa stands on this war. And other countries too, but it could be even harmful, like if you see, for instance, Macron active in coming to Africa and talking about the war, then maybe in some context of a former imperialist past, it might actually backfire. But basically, Macron also took part in trying to correct maybe position of a bunch of countries in Africa also in this war. So what shapes the Global South's views of the war? That's another topic, which is a big one, basically, and that's interesting always to try to see. First, I think it's just bare and basic regionalism, which I mentioned, like in Ukraine, for instance. You look at the Global South, say, in something happening in Africa, Equatorial Africa or something, and you say, well, it's too far. It doesn't concern us. So the same way on the other side, it's regionalism. So basically people are concerned with their local, regional, sub-regional, maybe even like mega-regional, but still far away from Ukraine concerns. So therefore, why should they care? In many interviews for Ukrainian media that I've been given in the last 2 years, I also mentioned, okay, like, why do you expect everyone in the world to lose their sleep over what Ukraine is going through? Did you lose your sleep in the recent years when there were major wars raging here and there around the globe? And people were suffering, people were killed and massacred in huge numbers, like say in Syria, and maybe like more than 500,000 people died since 2011. Did you really lose your sleep over this? Probably not, if you're frank in answering this question. So what would you expect everyone in the West, around the globe, really, specifically in the South, specifically in areas thousands of miles away, to be focusing on this war and be concerned and be mobilized and be on Ukrainian side? So that's one thing. Another thing, of course, is history of the Cold War and even deeper history of imperialism. So it's a lazy argument. It's on the surface. Many nations in the global South, they remember the times of colonialism really well, when French and British and others were basically having them as the colonies and depriving them of their sovereignty and self-determination. And the inertia goes like, okay, this country is now supporting Ukraine, so maybe Ukraine is also on the wrong side of history. In the same time, of course, there is also history of some anti-US sentiments in the region as well, anti-Western in general. And the legacy of Soviet Union. Tony actually mentioned that some African students studied in Ukraine, but many of them studied in Russia and still do. And over Soviet times, of course, many political elites in certain countries that were choosing socialist orientation, so to speak, in their development for whatever reason, they were connected to Moscow. And Moscow, of course, positioned itself always as an anti-imperialist power center, as a struggling and defending the rights of those peoples around the globe who are deprived of their sovereignty. So Putin is trying to capitalize on this now. In his recent speeches, actually, and other people in Russia, but mostly Putin, he's been mentioning all the time that yes, we are actually standing against Western imperialism, and Ukraine is just a puppet of Western imperialists. We are in Ukraine are trying to explain to people when we talk to people in the region, and I've done that a number of times with various roundtables and panels online, that on the contrary, Russia is imperialism. But the concept of Russian imperialism is definitely not familiar to a lot of people around the globe, unlike the concept of, say, French or American or British, or I don't know, even like German or Belgian, whatever, imperialism in the history of the world. That is established fact. People are still living through it. And say, if you're talking about South America, they got their independence, most of them, 200 years ago, more or less. In Africa, that's basically like 50, 60 years ago. So it's more recent memory also. People were still living, who were living in those countries when they were not countries and they were colonies of certain European nations. I think there's also, and no insult, of course, is meant here on my part, but there is certain transactionism, and why not? Because certain countries in the region, they would say, okay, but what is it for us in it? Say, supporting Ukraine. Say, Secretary Blinken coming in and saying, you need to support Ukraine and denounce Russia. So they would say, okay, for us to do it, what can you give us to motivate us to do it, to take this position? Because we might otherwise not be necessarily interested in taking any position on this issue, for that matter. So there's a certain amount of transactionism, and many countries, say in Africa, for instance, for sure, they are looking like, okay, Russia is coming in and they might offer something economically, otherwise. China is coming in, and China is aligned in many ways with Russia, and they are heavily present in Africa, and they might offer something. So, and then Americans are coming in and say, take this position, and why should we take that position? So can you offer us anything interesting for us economically, politically, security-wise? Maybe weapons, I don't know, but that would push us and drive us towards taking a certain position, which would be in line with American position, a Western position, to simplify it a little bit, Western position on the war between Russia and Ukraine. And final reason, but probably not the complete list, not the exhaustive list of what shapes global South's views on the war is Russian propaganda. I mean, it's been everywhere. It's been very well oiled machine, well funded, with very capable people running for years and years and decades, really, in pushing the Russian narrative here and there. And in some parts of Europe, of Africa, for instance, as you know, Russia is even present militarily, and with Wagner and others. And if before 22, maybe they were primarily interested in just being for hire, maybe being invested in some natural resources exploration in here and there. or maybe just getting some money for their efforts and their service. But now it's changing because in some places they're basically just supporting regime changes, for instance, like in Niger, where anti-American, anti-Western government is coming to power, and they would say, okay, we're working with them. So they also, Wagner and others, because they were always an arm of Russian government, Russian regime. It's not really a private military company. They are now seeing this in the context of the war. And most finally, I think for Ukraine, of course, this region is a complicated one. There are many difficulties. One, for instance, like I said, it's been often seen outside of the list of priorities for Ukraine for a long time, understudied, understood, what drives people there, what motivates them, how we can use it, what narrative should we use, what kind of arguments can we use. And I'm completing my presentation here in talking to people in this region. We're primarily focusing now on Russia waging imperialistic war against Ukraine and trying to explain why it is imperialistic and trying to bring some examples from our history of bilateral relations and basically tell people that this is not something new. This is not that NATO or Washington decided and just pushed Ukraine to do. We actually have troublesome relations with Russia for centuries. So it's not coming completely out of the blue. So we're trying to explain to the people there is growing attempt of economic presence, selling stuff, and Ukraine is trying to get more food stuff to the region and actually emphasize that we are going through a lot of troubles. Like many ships are going from city of my hometown of Odessa, for instance, leaving the port, being afraid of being attacked by Russian missiles, for instance, and going through this slowly through this newly reestablished corridor, grain corridor in Black Sea, for you, basically in Africa, to get some food on the plate. So we're trying to use this argument, and also diplomatic presence. I mentioned that it's a big deal. You know, Russia is very well established in Africa. You know, they have membership embassies in each and every country. A lot of people working, many times ambassadors there for a long time. They know everyone locally. They're connected to local political elites. With Ukraine, it's very different, and often we are up against the wall. We have a very capable ambassador, my former student, for instance, Lyubov Bravitova, who's our ambassador in South Africa. And she is often desperate. You know, she's trying to change narrative. It's probably actually even changing slowly. But she says, you know, because of this history and inertia of, when African National Council, is that the name, I think, was supported by Moscow, you know, that's it. That's enough. You know, so the West was bad, Russia was good. And now it's very difficult to just fight against this narrative, but she's trying. So Ukraine is definitely facing headwinds. In many respects, but we're trying. That's not going to change overnight. You know, I'm always saying that we can't change the people's predispositions overnight just because we have this major war on our hands. It will going to take a more sustained, multi-year effort to actually maybe change people's views about Ukraine-Russia relationship. But here I am. I would like to stop right here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vladimir. And now we'll hand over to Samir.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to BISA and my esteemed colleagues for this opportunity. Thank you, Professor Hastrup, on presenting the perspective from African nations. And thank you so much, Professor Dubovik, because you have really set the context very well for many of the points that I wanted to raise. So thank you so much for presenting the Ukrainian views of Global South. My background is in international development, and I'll try to develop my argument from this standpoint. So in the next 10 minutes, I will offer a perspective from Global South using the case of India. I'll try to state what India's stance on Ukraine is and what it means in practice, and then I will try to offer 3 key explanations that might help us understand why India has chosen this strategic stance and how it is rooted in its geopolitics, domestic politics, historical ties with the Soviet Union, and its current contemporary economic interests. So India's stance on Ukraine is that of a public studied neutrality, as Professor Ashley Tellis calls it. It's studied neutrality, a very strategic neutrality. What does this mean? So while on one hand, India is not supporting sanctions towards Russia, and it continues to maintain diplomatic relations with Russia at the same and continues to abstain from voting against Russia in the UN Security Council, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, does not openly call Russia the instigator of the invasion. But however, in diplomatic ties and calls between Modi and Putin, the Indian head of state has said that this is not an era of war and tried to stress that it's a time for democracy, dialogue, and diplomacy. Along with India, several other countries which might come under Global South, such as China or UAE, they have also abstained to vote against Russia in the UN. Now, there might be many reasons why different countries in the global south don't support. It's not one homogeneous reason, because it's not a homogeneous region. After all, it's very complex, global south. However, I think there is a little bit of distrust that global south economies or countries have towards sanctions, because they themselves would have been subject to sanctions for different reasons. For example, in India, when it started its nuclear program, it was also subject to some sanctions. So there is generally a distrust on sanctions as an instrument, and their colleagues at War Studies, as Rishika Chauhan, who have written about it, and a lot of literature on sanctions as well. Now, the question arises that why India, and this is where it connects with what Professor Dubovik was saying, that why India as a post-colonial nation state, which has extensive experience dealing with what imperialism looks like. Ukraine as a post-Soviet state is very much also very similar to post-colonial states, because the nature of imperialism is very similar. They are both, as post-imperialist states, very much subject to similar structures and impacts that imperialism leaves behind. For Ukraine, the imperialism, as mentioned earlier, it can be traced back to the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. So it's anywhere between the last 50, 60 years to more than 200 years if we go back into history. And the current invasion of Ukraine by Russia would be akin to the UK invading India, claiming it to be a part of it itself. So how does India not outrightly condemn this imperialist drive that Russia has in invading Ukraine, because it has the shared experience of living under an imperial rule? This is also very, very key in contemporary Indian context, because the change of territories by brute force creates a highly dangerous precedent for other nation states. India, with its dual military challenges with both Pakistan and China, it cannot afford to ignore this, because this can lead to similar challenges within it, in the disputed territories between India and China, particularly. So despite being post-imperialist society, they should understand each other. But why is this particular stance taken by India? And on it, having said this background, now I will try to pull out different explanations that can help us understand this. First is the very specific and complicated geopolitics of India. We do not get to choose our neighbors. So similarly, in the case of India, it doesn't have a choice in who its neighbors are. And the very threat of war on its borders makes India wary of Russian invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, it actually prevents India from condemning Russia, because India is really afraid if it isolates Russia in this, India would lose a key partnership with Russia, which helps to balance its tensions with China. So India-China tensions are balanced by India's strategic partnership with Russia. Further, if India were to isolate Russia, then Sino-Russian ties would get stronger, and then this can have a dangerous impact on India if the Chinese have a stronger influence on Russia. This is also steeped in history, in India's own particular history, in its neighborhood. In the 1971 war in Bangladesh, India depended on Soviet Union for help, while the West, let's say represented by Kissinger and Nixon in the US, had allowed millions of Bangladeshis to die and blocked India's efforts, because at that time, US foreign policy was very much dictated by its domestic politics. And for Kissinger to have access to China through Pakistan was very important. So those experiences also have created distrust within Indian foreign policy. Second, related to India's national security issues, is that India is heavily dependent for up to 65% of its current military equipment, which comes from Russia. In the past, while other Western powers denied to share advanced technology with India, Russia, which was formerly the Soviet Union, which is now kind of represented by Russia for India, did share its advanced technology, and that has made India also highly dependent. Specifically in the Air Force and Navy, India relies on importing large equipment from Russia. Now, these are very, very time-consuming to make indigenously, and to provide the infrastructure indigenously, which will then help India manufacture its own equipment, is a very expensive process. So while India is aware that it needs to diversify its sources of weapons, and it has tried to do so by doing this with France, USA, and also pre-war Ukraine, but it still remains largely dependent on Russia, because it also has weapons that need to be maintained, and new parts have to be bought, which also come from Russia. So India is not militarily and economically strong enough to meet the challenges challenges that it faces on its borders with China without external help, while China, on the other hand, is more than capable of doing so. In 2014, India also started this very a key economic flagship program called the Make in India scheme, and its focus was on boosting the defense infrastructure. So within the next few decades, India can rely less on imports and reduce its single source dependency on weapons. But still, it's going to take at least 20, 30 years, if not more, for India to reach that capacity. Further, it is also important to note that India is a state which has limited influence outside of its region, outside of the Indian Ocean, and therefore it cannot risk upsetting any of the greater powers. And this also is behind India's very strategic autonomy, this principle of strategic autonomy, as well as carrying out a balancing act between the greater powers. Now I come to the third point, which is more of an economic point, which is that in February 2022, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, India was still emerging from the after effects of the pandemic. India is reliant on importing oil, and I think the 36% of India's oil imports, crude oil imports, are coming from Russia, which is very, very significant for a country like India, which has limited oil resources. So in the national interest and in this particular stage of economic recovery, it is harder for India to forego a time-tested partnership, and it makes more economic sense. And India is very much guided by its national interest because of its particular geopolitics. Now, I started by talking about how India and Ukraine might be similar because of their post-imperialist experiences. But let's look at how India and Russia might be similar in some ways. What are the commonalities between the Russian state and the Indian state in the contemporary times? Since 2014, India has seen a rising wave of nationalism, which is quite muscular and aggressive in nature. And it is very similar to Putin's muscular nationalism idea and Putin's imperialistic project. So in this year, 2024, India will be going into national elections as well. And the projection of an assertive foreign policy, which is independent and kind of is projected as kind of launching India onto the national state and is being carried out by India's Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. It has a great impact on how Indian citizens view the ruling government, and domestic politics are very much linked to it. However, one would wonder if within India there is a contestation of what Indian government stance has been on Ukraine. However, the contestation is almost negligible because even the opposition party, which rightfully criticizes the ruling party on many different things, actually sees eye to eye, and the opposition in India also supports the stance towards India's neutral stance on Ukraine. Now, we have to remember that the opposition party is the Congress party, which is where the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, was elected from. And Nehru had very cordial relations with Soviet Union and Russia. And despite the non-aligned movement in the Cold War era, India grew was quite close to the Soviet Union. India's historic ties with Soviet Union also carried on into the post-Cold War era. Speaking about how students went to study in Russia as well as Ukraine, there's also this very strong soft power that Soviet Union had in India. And because Soviet Union can be seen as an imperialist power, it was mostly Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian heritage, which was preeminent over other states, other smaller states that were part of the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union became almost synonymous with Moscow. And during the Cold War period, Soviet Union helped India in building its infrastructure, industrialize, develop its space and technology programs and military defense equipment. However, this Russian soft power was really prevalent and strong. The popular perceptions through collaborations in the entertainment industry, in the film industry, as well as the circulation of Russian language literature, which was translated into various regional languages in India and were accessible throughout, really had a very strong impact. People who grew up in the Cold War generation, as well as to some extent people who grew up in the early 1990s, they inherited this very strong affinity for Russian culture and literature, which went a long way in creating a very positive image of Russia. Obviously, this is in stark contrast to the Eastern European states in the Soviet Union, whose own culture, heritage, and language was crushed. For example, the very, very brutal Holodomor famine in Ukraine, which was orchestrated by Stalin as a means of crushing Ukrainian national identity. So there's obviously this very stark contrast, and how, despite being a post-imperialist country, India sees the post-Soviet nation states differently. There is a small observation I would like to add, since we are talking about soft power, is that the cultural exchange between Ukraine and India seems to be starting in very subtle ways. By sheer luck or chance, one of the very famous movies to come out of South India called RRR, it was set in the backdrop. The story of that movie is set in the backdrop of British Empire in India, they shot a song in front of the Mariinsky Palace in the presidential residence in Ukraine before the war began. Now, the song that was characterized as a dance-off between native Indians and British imperialists and was a jibe at British imperialism became really popular, even winning an Oscar last year. However, a few months ago, the Ukrainian army recreated the Indian song, except replacing the Indian side with the Ukrainian side and the historical British imperialists with contemporary Russian imperialists. This seems to be an initiation by the Ukrainian side, and it is emerging, I believe, as a significant soft power acknowledgement and an interaction between Ukraine and India. This was quite interesting, I thought. Now, coming back to the idea of global South, countries across the global South are skeptical of Western values and norms, as they find it to be set unilaterally with less dialogue with the peripheral nation states. If we zoom into India's neighborhood, the South Asian neighborhood, when the US pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, there was a sense that this was done with no regards to the concerns raised by other countries or to the consequences that the neighboring countries may have to undergo, and they were left to deal with these things themselves. It has to be said that India does not want the invasion of Ukraine to continue, however. This is for two reasons. First, the longer the invasion of Ukraine continues and strengthens, Russian ties with China are going to emerge stronger, which will not be very positive from India's perspective. Second, a weakened Ukrainian economy is going to have effects across the world economy. A destabilized Europe is going to have catastrophic impacts on the rest of the world because of disruptions in the global supply chain, as we saw with the Russian blockade of the Black Sea when the war began. And this can really destabilize the global South or the global East countries, as we would like to call them, who are still recovering from the crushing effects of the pandemic. It can be really catastrophic. So with all of this, I hope I've conveyed the complexities of India's regional politics, national interests, and how this is shaping its stance as an emerging state with limited influence, but trying to navigate a complex world order. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simia. That's great. Next, we'll hand over to our discussant, Natasha Kurt, for some thoughts to bring this together.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Vicky, for chairing, and thank you to all the really interesting speakers who have already gone before me. I don't want to spend too long, but I just wanted to maybe speak to a few of the commentaries and also to maybe say a bit more about China. I mean, I think it, personally, I just find it very interesting, fascinating, the way in which this war has, if you like, put the global South in the spotlight in a way which I think it hasn't been really before. I think, as has been acknowledged, the global South, of course, is a very unsatisfactory in some ways term, for sort of obviously a range of different countries with very differentiated interests and foreign policies and so on. But then I think also, a number of people in the global South, find it quite useful in many ways to kind of take ownership, if you like, of that label. So I think some of the things I just wanted to mention were essentially, I found it interesting when Tony was talking about the agency of African countries, which, there's a sense, of course, in which, you could argue that perhaps the agency of African countries and some other countries in the global South is being finally recognized in a way. Countries in the West are sort of almost courting, some of those leaders, because I think there's a sort of a slightly stunned, maybe, acknowledgement that, oh, okay, actually, they can speak for themselves, and they're not going to necessarily, follow our lead, and that actually we can't really necessarily get that far by suggesting to them that they have to declare for one side or the other. I think that it's been kind of highlighted that really that kind of approach is quite unproductive in that particular context. So when the West talks about defending a rules-based order, it says, look, this war represents, Western values which we're fighting for, which are at stake, and so on. Please come on our side. Don't stop voting, with Russia, or stop abstaining in the UN General Assembly, and so on. But that's not really necessarily a compelling argument for a number of global South countries, and that's not necessarily because they don't specifically subscribe to those values, although I think we've obviously seen, discomfort and suspicion of, certain ways in which human rights, R2P and so on have been used, I think, for some of those countries instrumentally in the past. They just don't necessarily want to frame the war in that particular way. There was quite an interesting quote by, I think it was a Colombian diplomat at the Munich Security Conference last year. He wasn't the only one. There were people from Namibia, Brazil, Indonesia, and so on, who essentially said, we have a very different view of this war to the United States. And the Colombian delegate said, we don't want to go on discussing who will be the winner or the loser of this war. We are all losers, and in the end, it is humankind that loses everything. And so, while obviously this is very broad brush, and I'm not suggesting that this is true of all leaders, diplomats in the global South, I think there has been a sense in which they feel as if they're being put on the spot, so to speak. And it's not that they don't necessarily empathize with the plight of Ukrainians, but for them, and I think that has been suggested, it's happening in a country very far away. And I think there was, I can't remember whether it was a Ghanaian diplomat, but essentially there was an African politician who said, look, where was the West, when genocide was happening in Tigray and so on. So there's this kind of sense in which, it feels unfair to them to be put on the spot in that way. And essentially that's where I think China, for example, obviously China has been accused of sitting on the fence and so on. But, China's role is very interesting because it has that kind of dual identity, essentially, as both a developing country and also a P5 member. And that's where, it draws its legitimacy and authority from within the UN. And, China, can really set the messaging very often within the General Assembly and through the Human Rights Council as well. And of course, let's not forget that China also, by dint of its peacekeeping contributions, which are not just about troop contributions, which of course is relatively new for China, but also about quite high financial contributions. And so it is unique amongst the P5 in these financial and troop contributions to UN peacekeeping, which is a core activity of the UN. And so I think China is very well placed in that sense, and through its partnership, or whatever we want to call it, with Russia, obviously the two of them have been able to exert some pressure, I think, on global South countries. But as Tony also reminded us, there is more nuance to the voting patterns than perhaps is sometimes acknowledged. And again, that kind of binary approach, I think, is not helpful at all. And if we look at what China has been doing, in 2021, it launched the Partnership for Africa's Development. It has contributed money to capacity building for regional peacekeeping in Africa and so on. whereas, the West's record is not, certainly recently, is really not a stellar record at all in terms of, investment, in terms of all sorts of security issues as well that might need to be helped with. And coming to security, obviously, that's an area where Russia seems to have been essentially turning itself into this kind of niche security provider. Now, that doesn't necessarily in and of itself, of course, bring direct influence. And I think we only have to look back at the Soviet period, which, of course, is now being valorized and reified as, within Russia as, some kind of golden era where, Soviet Union had this kind of, very deep influence in the third world. Now, of course, and I think Soumya also spoke to that, of course, there is a certain kind of residual influence, deriving from the kind of Soviet legacy, if you like, of economic assistance and so on to the third world. But I think we should also bear in mind that that influence was much less than perhaps had been expected by Soviet leaders, and that the provision of weaponry and military materiel and so on did not actually guarantee any loyalty. And I think the Soviet leaders actually, struggled with the fact that, many of these leaders, many of these countries were actually not at all loyal. They couldn't buy loyalty by dint of this military assistance, for example. And I think that that's very true now. So, so again, it's probably more about, a questioning of the West rather than necessarily, that these countries want to actually side with Russia. And it also speaks to a lack of Western strategy vis-a-vis some of these countries. Certainly, I think vis-a-vis Africa, there has not really been any kind of substantive strategy in place. So I think we kind of need to really look a little bit inwards in the sense of looking at how we have actually, whether we have actually had the right kind of strategy and approach to some of these countries rather than accusing them of failing to step up to the plate. And again, China, even from a rhetorical point of view, for example, it's kind of brought out this global civilizational initiative that is made up of various different components. I found it interesting to note that, as part of this global civilizational initiative, of course, it's sort of rhetorical flourish, but China suggested that we need to make the garden of world civilizations full of colors and life. And again, that speaks to the idea that, China constantly emphasizes, which is we should be valuing diversity above universalism. And it also came, not too long after Joseph Borrell's rather unfortunate remarks, that Europe is a garden, the rest of the world is a jungle, and the jungle could invade the garden. So that kind of image that the West has of the global South, I think very much speaks to this idea that the West essentially continues to behave towards many of those countries in a colonial manner. And so while I wouldn't want to suggest that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is positive, of course, not at all. But I think that we could examine our own consciences, if you like, and also, this could be a good moment to bring, I think, some agency back to the global South. But in fact, they are already, I think, if you like, reclaiming that agency. And I'll stop there.
Many thanks, Natasha, and indeed to all our panelists today. I think those excellent presentations provide a huge amount of food for thought and discussion.